And I don't know if it's maybe becoming a lost art. And again, this has to also do with my age. Uh, the words that he uses,
Mm,
I hardly hear those kinds of words in speeches today. Okay, so for example, he said the withering flames, which evokes a lot of emotion and a lot of imagery at the same time. I mean, it's even when I listen to Toastmaster speeches, I hardly hear words like that.
mm,
Now, these are words people understand. I don't think withering flames is something that people don't get. Okay, but at the same time, the loss of that use of such maybe precise words or exact
mm.
words that help deliver the message.
It's a good
Let,
point.
let, let me
Go
just
ahead,
add
Janice. Yes.
one more thing that I thought about when Paul was talking about the years that were integrated in the start of the speech of Dr. King. It helped. It helped really, and we'll see this later on in the speech. I think if you read the entire text, by talking about how long it has been for the African Americans to struggle, and also talking about recent developments in American history. Dr. King was laying the groundwork for how one this speech was a going to be a very historical speech,
Mm,
and at the same time, it laid down the groundwork which would show how the entire speech was building up towards this momentous crescendo in
mm,
terms of how this was going to be the tipping point for
mm.
a shift in history, which I think we'll see later on when we listen to the speech further. And I think that was a very effective way of really laying down the groundwork for the audience to see what they should be expecting.
Good day. Welcome to Tip Talks. It's a new show that's part of the series of playlists on the Leader's Edge by Speakers Bureau Academy. And in this show, we're here to talk about how great speeches changed history. And we're going to listen to inspiring ones, crazy ones, interesting ones, even hilarious ones. And so, in this particular show, we'll be hearing the words and insights of Toastmaster Hall of Famers, DTMs, seasoned speakers, people who have earned the right and react to those great speakers. And so I'm your host for today, Dino Santos, and I would now like to invite everybody to introduce themselves. So let me just say at the beginning that I am a Hall of Famer, having won the national speech to evaluate competition in 1986 during a Toastmasters convention in Baguio City. I'm a DTM and I've been a member of Toastmasters from 1991 when I was 18. I'm also a speech coach and a vocal dynamics coach. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Dino. Like Dino, I'm also a Toastmaster since not as long as Dino. I've been since 2016, I believe, on and off. There were some years I didn't actually join. On the communication side, basically, I'm a facilitator for leadership, and communication is a great part of leadership. In addition, I also work extensively with emotional intelligence. And at the core, excellent communication is still about emotional intelligence because you have to figure out your emotions and express them correctly. Experience wise, you could see by the color of my hair, I've been working for more than 30 years. I have experience being a CEO, being a frontliner. I've been fired. I've fired many people myself. So in short, I've been through all of the feelings, if you want to say, that many people experience in their careers.
Mhm.
Over to you, Janice.
Thanks, Paul. I'm Jan Ace. I'm also a Toastmaster like everybody else in the room. I've been a Toastmaster for 9 years. I am also a speech to evaluate champion and evaluation champion, but not at the nationals, at the Makati based clubs. So I've been a champion to an evaluation twice. And I love evaluating speeches. I love dissecting speeches. I love thinking about how speeches are made, about seeing what makes good speeches good. Outside of Toastmasters, I am the chief of staff of a member of Congress. So I worked in the intersection of public policy and politics. So communications is a very big part of what we do. A big part of politics is being able to speak well to stakeholders and constituents. So it's something that I'm exposed to every day. All right.
Thank you so much, Jan Ace. Thank you so much, Paul. And I'm so pleased that the two of you are with us. You know, all of us are here tonight to react to our very first speaker, who is none other than Martin Luther King Jr., who just recently celebrated his speech anniversary over at the United States, where he spoke about "I Have a Dream." And so that's the speech that we will be reacting to for the first time in this particular series. And just to let our viewers know, every speech that we will have on the show through content, objectives, and delivery. And it'll be a freewheeling discussion. So without delay, let's get on with it. And let me share the audio file. So, guys, let's give a listen to the great Martin Luther King Jr.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
I thought it was me for a
100
moment.
years
Oh, no. There we are.
The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
Okay, let's pause the audio file briefly. So let's start maybe with how the great Martin Luther King Jr. do in terms of his attention getter. Any reaction?
It's
That's me.
all right. I could start off. It's a very interesting way to start off a speech because it it immediately contextualizes that the speech is something big
Hmm.
because he says something along the lines of it being one of the greatest demonstrations in American history.
Hmm.
So I feel that in terms of the way what he said and the way it's delivered is immediately grabs your attention.
Hmm.
Uh, what and we talked about this before the start of the podcast. Martin Luther King had as a minister, as a preacher,
Hmm.
and the way he spoke and the way he entered with that speech, it immediately evokes an image of somebody delivering a sermon.
Yeah.
It begs to get your attention, and I felt that it was a very effective way to really capture the attention of the people in that demonstration.
Hmm. Thank you for that, Janice. Paul, what do you think?
The other thing that immediately caught my attention was, if I'm not mistaken, the Gettysburg Address also started with so many score years.
Hmm.
So there was an immediate connection. And I'm also quite sure that in those days, in the educational system of the US, the Gettysburg Address was a speech that everybody knew.
Hmm.
Okay, because even I studied it. I went to the American system. And so that's about maybe about 10 years about relative to my being in grade school, if you want to say. So I'm pretty sure that that the speech also started with four a mention to time span.
Mm.
Okay, so he kind of, how would you say, he kind of connected the two almost immediately just by starting the same way.
Mm. The way that
So
I react.
that was a good
Okay.
that's in that sense it was a good opener for me.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. The way that I reacted to it wasn't so much the words that he used, but I reacted to it from how he said it. Because as he began to speak, I could feel that he was speaking with not necessarily a heavy heart, but it's like finally, that sense of feeling that finally I have the attention of the nation. I have a united people ready to listen to my words. And so he started slowly. He wasn't into fire and brimstone at the beginning because he could be that way when he wants to be, but he started slowly. He wanted to impress on people. My guess is he wanted to impress on people that this is a momentous occasion, and I come to you with a heart full of hope, full of aspiration. So that's the way it came across to me, the way he was saying it. Because sometimes, great speakers might thunder off from the very beginning, the way Churchill might, or the way Roosevelt did on his famous Day of Infamy speech. But no, Dr. King started off gently, slowly. Hmm. Okay, so
The other thing that I liked, and I don't know if it's maybe becoming a lost art, and again this has to also do with my age. Uh, the words that he uses,
mm,
I hardly hear those kinds of words in speeches today. Okay, so for example, he said the withering flames, which evokes a lot of emotion and a lot of imagery at the same time. I mean, it's even when I listen to Toastmaster speeches, I hardly hear words like that.
mm,
Now, these are words people understand. I don't think withering flames is something that people don't get. Okay, but at the same time, the loss of that use of such maybe precise words or exact
mm.
words that help deliver the message.
It's a good
Let,
point.
let, let me
Go
just
ahead,
add
Janice. Yes.
one more thing that I thought about when Paul was talking about the years that were integrated in the start of the speech of Dr. King. It helped. It helped really, and we'll see this later on in the speech. I think if you read the entire text, by talking about how long it has been for the African Americans to struggle, and also talking about recent developments in American history. Dr. King was laying the groundwork for how one this speech was a going to be a very historical speech,
Mm,
and at the same time, it laid down the groundwork which would show how the entire speech was building up towards this momentous crescendo in
mm,
terms of how this was going to be the tipping point for a shift in history, which I think we'll see later on when we listen to the speech further. And I think that was a very effective way of really laying down the groundwork for the audience to see what they should be expecting.
Thank you so much, Janice. Also, I'd like to add to what Paul was saying, and that is that the art of poetic writing is something that's lost to us these days because, as Paul said, the withering flame, that's not something that we hear often. Um, we might hear, as a result of listening to a song, say the dying embers, which again is a tool, a poetic tool to let us see the depth or the intensity of the emotion that's being felt. So it's a lost art. But let me ask Paul, would you welcome the use of more poetic devices or tools in today's speakers?
Well, for me, absolutely, I would. Uh,
Mm,
It's just that, at least for me, it's again, uh, I was educated in a system where I had to study Shakespeare.
Oh yeah, okay.
Okay, all right. Where I had to study the greatest poets of the U.S. and the U.K.
Mm,
So I could at least see it there.
yes.
I could have that exposure, if you want to say.
Mm, yeah.
So if I really sit down and put my head to it, yeah, I could, I can do it.
Mm,
But maybe I don't know why. As you said, it's a lost art, or maybe it's not gaining traction. But I would definitely love to see it come back.
mm,
Because if you have the right combination of words, my goodness, the impact it has and the imagery it evokes is
mm.
really can be really very powerful.
Yeah. I think that even today we see that being practiced in things like short phrases where you hear people say, "We're not looking for perfection, we're looking for progress." Or when we hear people say, for example, this is one of those quotes that I really love from Shakespeare, because when I first heard it, it knocked me over. I heard it from a political science student, and I couldn't believe how powerful those words were when Shakespeare once said, "Today marks the winter of my discontent." And then when I thought about that, okay, I didn't realize that a person feeling discontent would have a winter of his discontent. Wait, is there a summer to being discontented? Or is there an autumn? But what it simply meant, and I'm sure you both know, is that he was describing that he is really scraping the bottom of the barrel when he used those words. And so I'm with you on that. That it would be nice if it made a comeback in our speakers and speeches today. Janice, what do you think?
I think so too. But I would like to add that it takes a very gifted speaker to be able to do that, which
Mm,
Dr. King was able to show here. Because if you're not a very capable speaker, and I've heard this many times in Toastmasters, that there's a tendency to go overboard,
mm,
because what makes the poetic language of Dr. King effective here is, even if it's a bit poetic, it's still concrete,
yeah.
like a withering flame. So you can immediately picture what that looks like, and a learned listener would immediately know what it means.
Mm,
But there's also the danger, if you're not a very capable speaker, to just throw
mm,
out a lot of these terms that sound eloquent and big words, but they don't really mean a lot of things, and they just make the speech sound convoluted and unnecessarily complicated.
mm,
So a lesser speaker would fall under the weight of that kind of language, but Dr. King was able to do it very effectively in the speech.
mm. You have a good point there, Jan Ace. And I
Well,
suppose, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
uh, uh, to build on what Jan Ace is saying, and this is something many people ask, and they talk about, what are some tips you have to come across as a great speaker? Uh, a lot of it has to do with the understanding of yourself.
Mm,
Okay, or maybe you can call it authenticity. I mean, if I'm still new and I don't know what to do, and I just start throwing things out like what Janice was saying, that's not being authentic.
mm,
Okay, he's just he's just trying to sound smarter than you are, if you want to say.
mm,
Because I heard this great quote from Dino about, don't aim for perfection, aim for progress. So I just start using it, and it comes across incorrectly. Well, that's because the person, as Janice is pointing out, maybe they have to develop that skill that they know themselves. Okay, they know they know their capacities, they know all of this. And that's part of the aspects of being a good speaker. You have to have a good knowledge of yourself.
mhm. I agree. One of the advantages that Dr. King had going for him is that at this particular point in American history, I think we can all agree that education was something that was very, very important to the average American. The GI Bill, soldiers coming back from World War II, took advantage of that to get their college degrees. And so he knew that he could use poetic freedom in delivering his speech because the people would understand it. Um, why don't we listen to the continuation of his speech and so we can react some more?
100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious.
Okay, let's pause there briefly. And now I'd like to throw another question to both of you. How do you feel about the forms of support that Dr. King used? Because after you get the attention of your audience, you begin to push forward your message, but you also have to back it up with evidence or with support. How did you feel about what he said in that second part of his speech?
I could go first.
Yeah, sure.
I think I'm looking at the speech now. It's a very elegant way of saying that you owe us,
Yeah.
basically. You owe
Yeah.
us. You owe us. 100 years, 100 years we've been owed unalienable right, the rights that we have been long deprived of.
Mm.
And this is not because I know that even today, when you have these kinds of demands coming from the African American community, there are people who would criticize that, oh, you're being too entitled.
Mm.
And Dr. King addresses those complaints in this part of the speech.
Mm.
100 years we've been mistreated. 100 years we've been treated as second-class citizens. But the Constitution says that we have these rights, and
Yes.
we have to cash in our check now. It's something. It's a debt that we haven't been able to get from you. You haven't been able to pay that to us. So I feel that it was a very effective way of really supporting the whole objective of the speech, and great imagery, cashing in the check,
Yeah.
showing how it's something that's long overdue for the African Americans.
Even when he said the island of poverty, it's like the African American was somehow isolated from the rest of society that was enjoying their benefits, their rights, while they had no access to it. So thank you for that, Jan Ace. Paul, how do you feel about the support that Dr. King gave?
Going back to your original point, there is no data. But he's also talking about what we often call as elephants in the room. I mean, they're obvious, just nobody wants to talk about it. Okay, like as you pointed out, what is it? We lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no data behind it, but everybody knows it. Okay, even in the others, he lives in exile in his own country. Again, there's no data to support that, but everybody knows and understands it.
Yes.
Okay, it's not. So in those cases, he's evoking the feelings. I mean, if he took out a data point and said, "Hey guys, look, here's the rich people, here are the poor people. It would have had no effect. You know what I mean? Okay. But instead,
Right, right,
he
right.
talks about the emotions involved. I mean, languishing and being in exile in your own country. These are all very very powerful powerful emotions. And even to Jan Ace's point, after he lays that all down, he says, "You guys owe us." Period.
Hmm. Those are all good points because in today's world, we will often hear company owners or say GM say something like, "That is a motherhood statement. Prove to me what you're saying." And so this is proof that you can make general statements and they work provided that they are a generally held truth, a generally held belief that people can relate to.
The biggest challenge there is when the belief is not true. Somebody once posted in Facebook. He goes, he goes, what is it? 6 plus 3 equals 9, and
Mhm.
5 plus 4 equals 9. I said, respect the other perspective. I said, I agree with that, but you've got a problem when somebody says 6 plus 3 equals 11 and insists he's right.
How true.
And that admittedly has a lot to do with maybe technology and everything else. Yeah, because that's a different challenge. Maybe it's a more modern challenge we might be having.
A good point too, Paul, because when he delivered his speech, he delivered this at the nation's capital. And so there
Mm.
was going to be a screen big enough or a projector bright enough to show an Excel spreadsheet to prove. I mean, Excel didn't even exist
No,
back then, so
Right.
he had to use picturesque words, words that would create mental images. And then when you say a
Mm.
check, like Jan A said, this is something people expect at the end of say 2 weeks. You get a paycheck because you're owed.
you make an interesting point there because today I can have a video wall behind me
Hmm.
when I'm speaking. Okay, in those days, especially in the days of William Shakespeare, they didn't have that.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
didn't. So
Mm.
and
Right,
they
right.
just had to use the words to create the feeling, to create the emotion.
Hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah, if you think about it, even philosophers like Plato back in the day only had an amphitheater. They didn't have a sound system, so they used the natural acoustics of wherever they happened to be. In this case, at least, the 20th century's technology allowed Martin Luther King Jr. to be heard by the audience. Any further words before we continue?
I think it just takes me back to when I was starting out as a Toastmaster. They always encourage, my mentors always encouraged me to try to deliver without visual aids because the
yeah.
challenge really of a good speaker is to be able to paint a picture with his words. And I think
Yes.
that's the point that we've been discussing here with how Dr. King was able to set up this earlier part of the speech.
Hmm. Okay, so let's listen to the rest of it.
Is today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent.
Okay. Let's talk about how the audience is reacting in this part of the speech. What's your take on it?
Well, the audience was definitely reacting. Every point he made,
Yeah.
they would cheer him along, and some would even repeat some of the words that he was actually saying.
Yes.
And so he was definitely getting their attention.
Mhm.
Okay, because it's very rare that even when you do a training, that somebody responds in a way that he heard what you said.
Yeah.
I mean, and in this case, it's obvious they did because they didn't even repeat what he said. Okay, or you could even see them nodding their heads, even though you're not watching a video. You can see, you can literally hear them nodding their heads.
Mhm.
And a lot of this, I think, is my goodness, the power of the metaphors he uses over and over again. Whoa, I said, this guy's really.
Mm. Yeah, and you could tell that he's beginning to climb up the peak. In other words, if this were a song, he'd gotten past the first two verses. Now he is coming to the chorus because soon will be the part where he begins to talk about the dream, and people are being drawn to it. So he's quite a master at building up the anticipation to where he's going to give people permission to really just rejoice with him, hope with him, cry out with him. So, what a master orator. Jan Ace, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, he it reminds you of I don't know if you both watch pro wrestling. In pro rest, in pro wrestling, they do scripted promos, and
Yes.
the challenge of a pro wrestler is to be able to get a reaction from the crowd. And the term that they use is, if you get a reaction from the crowd, you're able to work the crowd. And I think at this point, Dr. King is being able to work the crowd and getting himself really. Another wrestling term is getting yourself over, and Dr. King is able to get himself over already at this part of the speech. And I love, in particular, how the metaphors about justice
Yeah.
that he talked about in this part of the speech. It really evokes the driving force of King's brand of civil rights, which, in contrast to guys like Malcolm X, which had a very combative and violent stance.
Yeah.
King is emphasizing here that, hey, there have been injustices in the past, but I still believe that justice is within the capacity of this country. Justice is still not. This country has not yet been bankrupt of justice, and that's why we're fighting. That's why we're fighting for better rights, because there is hope that things will change.
That's true. I think what you're also saying is that he was advocating for people to take the moral high ground instead of
Yes, yes,
resorting to, say, doing things in a violent way.
yes, yes.
Yeah. Awesome. So, Are you ready to hear the crescendo of his speech now? Here we go.
will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality.
Wow.
1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred.
Wow.
We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny.
Let me just pause here briefly, because I can't help but want to ask both of you this question. As Dr. King was promoting the moral high ground or the peaceful way of changing the system, do you think that somewhere in the back of his mind that he might be martyred because of what he's doing, because of what he's saying? Was there that part somewhere, maybe in his thoughts, that I could get into serious trouble because of this?
I think so. I think from the very beginning of Dr. King being part of the civil rights movement, he was prepared to die for the cause.
Mm.
I mean, there was real violence that was being given to ordinary African Americans. And
Yeah.
what more for somebody who was the very face of the movement? So he knew. He knew.
Yeah. I think that's also something that we see not just in the US, but even in our country. We've had people who spoke from their heart and were martyred and became the trigger for change that happened later on. Sometimes there's a saying, and I think this is true even today, there's nothing free about freedom. It comes at a great price.
The go ahead, Tito.
Go ahead, Paul. No.
I was pretty much going to agree with what Jan Ace said. I mean, I don't think he was expecting to die, but he certainly was ready. Okay.
Mhm.
Which brings the thought to us. I mean, it sounds romantic,
Mm.
but in reality, I don't think many of us are really ready to die.
Yeah.
Okay. And this
Right,
goes
right.
back to EDSA one.
Mm.
I wasn't at the main event, if you want to say. I was on the sideshow,
Mm.
and what was striking was in the group that was gathering outside. I think it was the stations there in Celebrity, if you know that area.
Yeah.
There was somebody, and in those days CMT was required. Okay. And it was frightening because the guy I was standing next to, he said that the commander who was holding guard, he was sitting on top of an armored personnel character. He said, "That's my brother."
Mm.
I said, "What?" Yeah, opposite ends of the fence. And I was thinking, if they started shooting, I'd probably run away. I wouldn't stand there and say, this is the right thing to do. So it does sound romantic. And in reality, though, there are very few people who are really willing to do it.
Mm.
Uh, and those people, those are the ones who become the ones who are remembered.
Mm.
But what is tragic for me,
Mm.
and at the same time, unfortunately, data shows otherwise.
Mm.
Oftentimes, changes are outcome of violence. It's not peaceful.
Mm.
Okay, India with Gandhi, I think, was an exception. It is, but if you look at all other countries, they had a revolution which was not peaceful.
Mm.
Okay, people were shooting each other. Okay, so I'm talking about real change. Okay, not just symbolic change, if you want to say.
Mm.
Because EDSA for me it just turned out to be just more of a symbolic change. Nothing really changed over time, if you want to say.
Yeah.
Okay. Although it was peaceful, all right. But if you look at all other revolutions, it was an outcome of violence. It wasn't peaceful at all.
Mm.
Even
So,
the fact that Dr. King was assassinated was an act
mm.
of violence.
Mm.
So
Yeah. During that time, a number of them went one after the other. There was JFK,
yep,
his brother, Robert Kennedy,
yep,
and
lobby.
even later on, even Malcolm X himself was martyred. Uh, so great change sometimes comes at great price. And I'm with you there. Nobody wants to, but sometimes things happen that are beyond the speaker's control. And I think Dr. King,
Yep.
as John A. said, understood the risk. It's like the fleas go with the dog. If you speak out, then you need to be prepared for what might happen. But I'm with Paul here. If I can see it coming and have a chance to run away, why not?
Right. Right.
Yeah, to speak another day. Okay, so
And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend,
You know, when you listen to a great orator like Dr. King, the first time I heard this speech, many, many years ago, I couldn't understand why, but I was getting teary eyed. I'm not an African American, but I could relate with the feelings that the people in the crowd may have been feeling, because in this part of his speech, he was proving that he understood who his audience was, you know, where they're coming from. Your children are suffering. You, my fellow people, are suffering. But he's also saying that go back because change is coming. Powerful, powerful message. And you don't have to be African American to be moved by it. Any thoughts?
Well, for me, that was one of the more beautiful things about that speech. I mean, I did Google it. They said more than 200,000 people attended.
Wow.
And taking from Simon Sinek's Why speech, is his video. I said, this was the day before texting.
Oh.
Okay. This was the day before social media. And you could still get 200,000 people. But more importantly, it wasn't just, it wasn't just Black people.
Yeah.
It was everybody. Okay. And admittedly, at least from my recall, the 60s in the US was it was a difficult time for them. Okay, they were fighting a war that nobody really wanted to be into or do. Okay. The government was, how would you say, maybe extending itself too much into the people. The experiments with LSD and all that stuff was happening pretty much at that time. Okay, and it's, maybe the people are also a little fed up about many other things, not just the segregation. So the power it wasn't just the Black people that were there, they're also the white people. And can you imagine bringing in 200,000 people to an event and you can't even text or email or nothing?
The awesomeness of what happened and that speech is the fact that usually crowds like that are there to watch a rock star. Like, for example, Queen, when they did Live Aid, or say a popular actor or a popular singer. So you'd understand why they would gather that way. But here, they gathered to hear a speech. It wasn't to hear a song. It wasn't to see a performance. It was to hear the truth. Have somebody mirror their aspirations. Jan Ace, what do you think?
Yeah, I think on that point, it reminds me of I don't remember who said it, but something along the lines that it's Dr. King was on the cusp of being able to reach out to the culmination of an idea that has come of the right age. And he was able to really deliver the speech at the peak of the civil rights movement. And I think that's the reason why so many people were able to gather there. On another note, I think this particular part of the speech was a very effective, and I've seen this in other political speeches where you're calling people to do something very costly.
Mm-mm.
He was able to address, as in as you both pointed out, he was able to address how uh, the the struggles that people were seeing at the time, that they were experiencing at the time, and by acknowledging those struggles, he is able to invite them to continue struggling with him.
Mm.
Because hey, he's saying, hey, I know you've gone through a lot of sacrifices. I know you are still going through a lot of hardships, but what we're doing now is worth it. What
Mm.
we're doing now is something that will help overcome these hardships that we've experienced so far. And I think that's a very simple but effective way of getting people to join the movement, to
Mm.
just show them that hey, I understand. I've been through what you've experienced, and yet here I would still want you to call you to join me in something that might be costly but will ultimately be worth it.
You know, both of you made good points here because this was at the cusp of a lot of tumultuous events during that time in American history. They had Woodstock as a form of protest, although many would think it's entertainment. They were doing drugs too during that concert. And the mess they left was unbelievable. Of course, we also know that Kent State took place during that particular era. And that caused a lot of America's young people to feel the oppression that Dr. King was describing. Mm. Very, very interesting speech so far, but the
But
best is yet to come.
the one thing you mentioned about, let's say, a rock star,
Mm.
and I think this mainly has to do with the medium that's involved because, I mean, I'm sure you can still remember the days when a rock star could fill a stadium.
Yeah.
50,
Mhm.
60,000, like you said, Live Aid, but in those days, somewhere like Van Halen, he'd fill the stadium.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. But it's in essence for me, it's the same because when you listen to a rock star, there's something about the words he's saying and the music
Mm.
that brings you somewhere else, or how do you call? Maybe encourages a different thought.
Mm.
And the proper word that I'm thinking of is you'd say something like you get a cathartic moment.
Ah.
Mm.
Okay. And in essence, I think Dr. King was doing the same thing, but he just wasn't singing a song.
Mm.
Okay. In this case, it was a speech. And as Jan Ace pointed out, because of maybe the culmination of events, it was just properly timed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm. True. And a lot of the things that he's saying uh, really starts to build up to the point where he begins to say the same phrase over and over again.
Mm.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope.
Wow.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
Wow.
Wow.
Indeed. Oh my goodness. Whew. What a moving speech. Notice, if you will, that during the second part of the last portion of his speech, he wasn't talking about continuing the theme of feeling oppressed and that we should try to cash our check. But this time he was talking about inclusivity. He was describing unity, making people march under the same banner of freedom. And I kind of lost count how many times he said, "I have a dream," because the last count I had was, I think, something like 11, and then he switched over to "Let freedom ring," which I think I must have heard about 3 or 4 times. I'm not quite sure. Somebody out there must have the stats on this. What do you guys think?
So
Well, it's a
much to.
definite. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Jan. Go ahead, Jan Ace.
Paul, all right, you can go ahead.
Well, it's funny when he talked about what is it? Let Freedom Ring.
Mm.
The first thing that came to my mind was a song pretty much of that same era.
Oh,
If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning. That
yeah.
goes down. Let's ring the bell of freedom, and it
Mm.
talks about also unity and all that kind of thing. And the version that I know is the one from Trini Lopez. Okay, but I remember that one because I had to sing it in music class, and I liked the
Oh.
beat and everything. So it really, I mean, memorized the words. This is way back in second grade, okay, which I think was 1970 or 1971, something crazy like that. Anyway, it's definitely the way he wrapped it up was really really. You could there's a definite pace to the speech.
Mm.
Okay, it starts slow, then picks up. It's very clear. It's very evident, which
Mm.
definitely helps in the effectiveness of the speech as well.
Mm.
Uh, Other than the rigging part, which I thought was really funny because what came to mind was the earlier conversation you had about Trini. I said that's Trini Lopez. Thinking of okay, but
Yeah.
anyway, it was nice, and this is also got from that short video clip of Simon Sinek on why.
Mm.
I said he was talking about your dream, not his dream.
Mm.
Okay, that's when it became inclusive, if you want to say, and that's also why many people showed up, not just Negro, not just Black people.
Yes.
I mean, everybody showed up because
Yeah.
everybody had a dream, and it was a divisive time in the U.S. as well.
Mm.
Okay, actually, I don't want to say divisive, simply because divisions have always existed in the U.S. There's
Mm.
always been the Republicans and the Democrats.
Mm.
Maybe it's the hatred that was maybe causing the divisiveness to look larger than it is,
Mm.
or something like that. But there's definitely hatred going on at his time.
Mm.
Okay, both ways. Okay, um, which is also why he capped it off very well with these last few words.
True. True. Janice, what do you think?
I think really just when we reach this point in the speech, we it reminds me of how, again, how we set up everything.
Mm.
The first half of the speech was really laying down the groundwork for the challenges that were existing in America at the time, particularly when it came to African Americans. And then it goes to the point where he has a call to arms
Mm.
with his brothers and sisters from the African American community. And then now it goes into this climax of really calling
Mm.
everybody and showing, actually not just calling everybody, but showing everybody what can happen if the things that I have called you to join actually happen.
Mm.
We reach a point of inclusivity, of unity in American society that really encapsulates what freedom
Mm.
America really stands for. And it reminds me of that kind of shift into a very hopeful tone at the end of the speech. Really reminds me of I just finished reading an essay by J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings,
Mm.
about his philosophy of writing fantasy stories. And he has this concept called eucatastrophe,
Mm.
where he talks about how he was asked why he always included happy endings in his stories. And he said that happy endings point us towards what is possible.
Mm.
It opens the imagination for the things that we can aspire for. And he does this in a way where, from a very bleak situation, it shifts to a turning point that leads to the resolution that people desire for. And essentially, although this is not a fantasy story, it's reality. Essentially, King was doing something along those lines,
Mm.
showing how challenging the situation in America was and shifting it to his own dream for what America could be. And that really, I think, stirs up so many emotions. I can only imagine how people felt at the time, especially being part of that movement, because
Mm.
it was very, very moving also for me.
Indeed. Um, I think that it was a speech that was meant to be. I think Dr. King must have felt a sense of destiny the moment he stood up on that podium and began to give his speech. Um, I have a feeling that as he gave it, especially at the start and now at the end of it, that he knew he had an opportunity to galvanize a nation, to tie up all of the loose strings and get everybody to move in the right direction. Um, I remember what Dilip told me when I interviewed him yesterday. Um, he said that General Eisenhower, when he became president, was interviewed about leadership, and he famously said that, look at this string, and the reporter looked at the string that uh, President Eisenhower was pushing from behind, and he asked the reporter, "What do you see happening?" And the reporter said, "You're making a mess," because he was pushing the string from behind. And then he told the reporter, "Watch what happens now." He grabs the end of the string that was in front of him and he begins to pull it. And as he pulled it, the string straightened out and made progress. And then he asked the reporter, "So what do you think?" And the reporter said, "It's better to lead than to push." And as a speaker, Dr. King has always led all those famous marches, right? I mean, he was always at the front of it, ready to face the truncheons, ready to face the riot police. He knew what he was getting into. Great speakers like great leaders, even Gandhi, who was in that movie, shown to have been hit by all those sticks, knew that it would take a great deal of sacrifice and the power of words to move a nation. So,
Can you just brief Jan Ace on what your conversation was about Dilip? What was the topic?
sorry,
Mm.
I wasn't able to mention it earlier. Um, Dilip and I talked about how to motivate and inspire people who work for volunteer organizations,
Mm.
and that that interview was magnificent. I enjoyed really having a conversation with Dilip because he pointed out that though he's now retired as a pastor of his own church, he took all of the lessons he learned from Toastmasters and applied it even in other areas of his life like in ministry, in church. And he said, it's always when you lead that people tend to listen more, to follow more than when you push. When you're in front rather than when you're in the rear with the gear.
The
So,
rear of the gear.
The rear with the gear.
yeah, uh,
I
eh,
like that one.
yeah.
But to your point, especially about because when you look at emotional intelligence, that's something Eisenhower had in spades.
Mm.
I mean, the characters he had to deal with,
Oh yeah,
Charles de Gaulle,
yeah.
Montgomery, even his own generals, they
Oh
had their own egos. I said, my goodness. and he still managed to pull it off.
mm.
Okay, that's for me, that's really when it comes to emotional intelligence. He's the most recent, really, really good example that's there.
Mm.
Okay, but when it comes to those things about leadership, and I mean, I'm of the belief that leadership really hasn't changed. If you look at leadership, just the qualities, and it's been the same.
Mm.
Maybe it's been studied better. That's why now we see more aspects of it. But even that concept about leading from the front, or even showing compassion. There's a story about Alexander the Great. Okay, where he was marching his army in a desert, and they're all dying of thirst. Okay, and one of his slaves or helpers, his slaves were okay in those days, I guess. He offered him a glass of water, a cup of water. You know what he did? He knocked the cup of water down to the ground and he said, "What use is that water to me if my troops can't drink?"
Mm.
And I said, I mean, if your leader does that, in front of everybody. I said, my goodness. Talking about understanding the importance of being the first guy to go in and all that stuff. I said, my goodness. But even leadership was apparent even then. Okay, so even today, we talk about leadership being in crisis. I'm not too sure about that because leadership for me is steady. It's never changed. Okay, so
True. Janice, any closing words in reaction to Dr. King's speech?
Well, I finally remembered that quote I was trying to remember earlier. It's a quote from Victor Hugo. Nothing else. I paraphrase it a bit. Nothing is more powerful nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come.
Mm.
And I think in terms of what Dr. King was the message that Dr. King had here, it was an idea whose time did come when he delivered the speech. And it really was a combination of, I think this speech of Dr. King, I have a dream. It really is a great example of somebody who had the skills and who had the moral integrity to be able to capture the moment for himself and be able to deliver one of the greatest speeches in history. Because not everybody, if it were just an ordinary man, they would have fallen under the weight of the pressure of it. But here we saw Dr. King being able to deliver a speech that not only stirred emotions, but really was pivotal in terms of changing history. And we could only aspire to be as great of a speaker, as an orator as Dr. King.
Well put, Janice. Thank you so much to both of you, Paul, Janice, for joining us tonight for this panel discussion. And for everybody, if you like what you heard tonight, and if you're an aspiring speaker or somebody who has to deliver a speech, I hope you were taking notes. And do let us know what you thought about our discussion in the comment section below. And if you like to subscribe, please do, so that you get notified when new material comes up. Our next speech that will be one from Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address. So here in season 1 of Tip Talks, we shall be looking at speeches that inspire, speeches that move, speakers who change the world. And so, just like what we say in our parent channel, The Leader's Edge, learning is a never-ending journey with limitless vistas. Good day.